Hello, I'm Nathan Robinson, editor of Current Affairs magazine, and I am here today to have an argument. I am having an argument with Mr. Benjamin Studebaker. He is a, what are you now? What is your position now? Because you got your PhD, yes?
I just got the PhD from Cambridge, and now I'm on the job market.
Okay, so he is a prospective political science professor? Is that...
Yeah.
Is that the field? Yeah. So, prospective political recent graduate of Cambridge, and he is a blogger at benjaminstudebaker.com. He's also written for Current Affairs, and we are here today because we wrote sort of dueling articles. I wrote one entitled "An Ineffectual Biden Presidency is Better for the Left Than an Actively Authoritarian Trump Presidency," and Mr. Benjamin Studebaker took great issue with that, and he wrote an article of his own that was entitled, let me see if I get the exact title, "The Left Case Against Supporting Joe Biden in the General Election." So we have entirely diametrically opposed opinions on this, and today we're going to hash it out. So, why don't you start by giving us the left case against supporting Joe Biden in the general election?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about what's wrong with the Republicans, a lot of what's wrong with the Republicans comes out of and is in reaction to what's wrong with the Democrats. And in the past, often when Republicans win, it's because of dissatisfaction with right-wing things that Democrats do. And those Democrats end up producing more right-wing, more antagonistic Republicans. So to go all the way back to the start, in the 60s, Kennedy and Johnson are afraid of looking soft on communism, so they get into the Vietnam War. The public is concerned that Johnson can't end the Vietnam War, so they vote for Nixon. Nixon then escalates it. Carter, he puts Paul Volcker in charge of the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker jacks up the interest rate, jacks up unemployment. The public is devastated by that. They vote for Ronald Reagan, who then does a more intense version of that, does it more. Bill Clinton gets in, he shrinks the deficit, he takes all this money away from welfare, and then people respond to that by voting for Bush, who promises to give them the money back through tax cuts, and then he just gives it to rich people and spends it on wars. In Barack Obama's case, he gets elected to bring real hope and change following 2008. He then does sequestration, the Budget Control Act of 2011. He starves the rural areas of investment. They get ticked off. They vote for Trump. If we keep doing the same thing over and over, we're going to get the same result. And I think that we're going to get worse Republicans if we keep voting for these Democrats who don't deliver on the change, leave people frustrated, and therefore leave them susceptible to far-right stuff.
Yeah, the way I see your article is that there are two sort of central points that you make, and the first one is that as a matter of political pragmatism, it ends up hurting the left more to have a horrible Democrat in office than a Republican, and then the other part of it would be that Donald Trump isn't quite as bad. You say his bark is worse than his bite, and so a comparison on the substantive things that the two will do. So since the first point you've made is that first one, the pragmatic one, let me say that I don't disagree with any of your narrative of the recent history of the horrible Democratic Party. We are not going to argue about that because you and I write about it all the time and we basically have the same take on it. I agree with all those. I've written a whole book about how much Bill Clinton sucked. I've written 10,000 words on how Joe Biden sucks. I'm probably going to do, way more on how Obama sucks, looking back at, I just hate them all. The question I have for you, though, is the implication of that, though, that it's better to vote for Nixon than Humphrey? It's better to vote for Mondale? It's better to vote for Reagan than Mondale? It's better to vote for a second George H.W. Bush? When you are facing the general election in each of those circumstances, right, should we have re-elected Bush because Kerry sucked? This seems to me like it would be an argument for always voting for Republicans, and I don't really see the end game here, where Republicans seem to have far more substantively worse policies, Barack Obama, for whatever, he was, as much as we both groan about the Affordable Care Act, right? I would rather have Barack Obama in office than John McCain. Are we just supposed to have Republicans forever, Ben?
No, but I do think that sometimes we are better off with the Republicans. So to take 2004 as an example, if John Kerry had won in 2004, John Kerry would have taken the blame for Katrina. He would have taken the blame for the 2008 crisis. He would have also taken the blame for the failure of the Iraq War, and the Bush supporters would have been able to say that if Bush had won, it would have eventually come around. He would have taken the blame on all of those fronts, and after 2008, we would have gotten a very nasty Republican who would be running on the failed record of Democrats and arguing that it's because of the lack of Republican economic policy that we got 2008, which is what happened in Britain. In Britain, there was a Labour prime minister in charge during 2008, and the reaction to that was to drag Britain very, very swiftly to the right immediately after 2008, to the point where the country is largely unrecognizable compared to what it was. And I think that the 2004 election is a great example. Kerry, notoriously a flip-flopper, notoriously was for the Iraq War before he was against it. I don't think he would have deviated from the second Bush administration on any of those central issues. And I think that because we got a second Bush, everyone got to see how terrible he was. It became without a doubt the consensus that he was bad. And then there was an opening. The Republicans responded by going with McCain, who had been the moderate competitor of Bush in 2000. So they softened a little bit compared to where they had been. And the Democrats had an option to run almost anybody. The Democrats could have won with anybody in 2008. Like Trump said in the primary, even Abraham Lincoln couldn't have won that election for the Republicans. So when you give them two terms, they overreach. They recognize that they overreach. They moderate a little bit. They give way a little bit. Their base gets frustrated because of the moderation. Their base doesn't show up. And then we can run basically anyone we want and stand a good chance of winning. But in the election after they win the first term, that's when they tend to, we tend to run some kind of bad moderate because we're afraid of them winning again, like we did with Kerry. And then we end up.
Can I just be clear? Is the implication, though, that you should have voted Republican in 2000, Republican in 2004, right? Because if you voted Democratic in 2000, you would have gotten Al Gore. Again, in the general election, assuming the primaries went the way they did, the correct move was to try and elect Bush in 2000. The correct move was try to re-elect Bush in 2008. Once Barack Obama was the nominee, presumably we didn't want Barack Obama because he's one of these, because he led to Trump. So you should have voted Republican in 2008. After Barack Obama's first term, when he was so disappointed, and we know now that his second term did in fact lead to Trump, you should have voted Republican in 2012. I find, and of course you shouldn't have voted for Clinton. You should have voted Republican. So is the implication here that we should just vote Republican every time in the general election because it's good for the left?
Not every time, but sometimes. Sometimes. I think 2004 is a clear example of a case when it would not have been good for Kerry to win. Nothing would have been improved by Kerry winning. And we would have gotten a Republican in 2008 who would have used the crisis of 2008 to do the kind of austerity that we saw in the UK. So I think that sometimes it's better to vote, at least to not vote for the Democrat. Then once you concede that it sometimes is, then you have to look on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, but I mean, as I say, when I lay out all of those instances, according to the theory, it would seem to suggest that every one of the last 5 elections you should have voted Republican in.
Well, I do think that there's a danger to voting for a moderate Democrat, because the moderate Democrat's going to promise to help people and then not deliver. And that's going to leave them frustrated. It's going to leave them not believing in our institutions. It's going to leave them less sympathetic to the whole Democratic project and to the left as a whole. So oftentimes, if we can make those moderate Democrats lose, then that gives the Republican an opportunity to screw up and take the blame for what goes wrong. And it gives us an opportunity sooner to try to put someone else in. When we get a moderate Democrat in, a couple of important things happen. One is that the Democrat fills the administration with 10,000 Buttigieg's, who then develop old boy networks and run for all the other offices in the country, dominate the party, and give us no space to make any move into it. And the other thing that happens is that the Democrats take the blame for all the right-wing stuff that both parties have been doing consistently. And the left, because it's attached in the mind of most people to the Democratic Party, also takes that blame. So we face setbacks organizationally and culturally when the Democrat is in office.
But let me give you my take on the alternative here, because it seems to me like your story here is that essentially, I agree. Every time a Democrat gets into office, they suck, and then people notice that they suck, and then they want to flip to the Republicans, who seem to suck less, and then the Republicans also turn out to suck, so they come back to the Democrats, who also suck, and it's just an endless cycle of the same damn thing all over again. To me, the implication of that is not, well, we should vote for the Republicans, but instead, this is not going to end until we build a serious left alternative. And to me, the thing that you should do is challenge the Democratic president so that you have a left that distinguishes itself very clearly. And this is why, of course, I liked Bernie Sanders, right, in 2016, because I thought he was taking exactly the right approach, which is, what do? We run a Democrat who's not a Democrat, right? We run in the primary. We try to beat the Democrat in the primary. But then, if that project doesn't succeed the first time, because obviously it's a long-term project to oust the Democratic Party establishment, then you kind of got to fall in line behind the Democrat in the general election, simply because, and we'll get to this, I think, just on the substance, there is so much more human suffering under a Republican administration. And I actually think that I'm not completely convinced that it is easier to organize and build under a Republican president than a Democratic president. Occupy Wall Street, right, occurred as a reaction to Barack Obama. The Vietnam War protest movement occurred under Lyndon Johnson, in part because when Democrats are in office, it's really easy for us to say, as the left, Democrats are the problem as well. Look, nothing has changed. The substance of the system is the same, whereas under Republicans, there's a very plausible argument that the problem is just the Republican Party. And again, now, what do we have now? What did we have in this primary? Everything focused on Trump, so that it was difficult to get out the case that the Democratic Party themselves are actually not much better. So I don't really see that much of a difference between the opportunities that we have under a Republican and the opportunities we have under a Democrat, but I do agree that until we organize a left alternative, we're going to be stuck in this cycle.
Yeah, so I would say that at the end of the first term of a Republican, you're right. At the end of the first term, the election is entirely dominated by the personality of the Republican president and by the Republican Party. And that's why we always run a centrist after the first election. And it's this middle presidential election in between the first and second Republican term where I think the case for the Democrats is the poorest, because they always run someone really, really bad. And they're depriving the Republicans of having to see the consequences of what they've done in the first term, which will hit in the second term. And if there's a Democrat in office, the Democrats will get the blame for that. I think that when we look historically, if we talk about 68 or we talk about Occupy, what followed 68? Richard Nixon beating McGovern in 72. What followed Occupy? We got Donald Trump. These activist movements that generate a lot of energy during these Democratic administrations don't end up prevailing in the long haul. And to use an issue that I saw you were talking about earlier today, climate change. Biden promises to do all this stuff about climate change. And you made the point that, of course, he's not very trustworthy on this. We have to hold him to account, right? Well, of course, during the Obama administration, they didn't succeed really in holding him to account. And he did a lot of fracking, and that fracking lowered oil prices and ushered in a whole new generation of oil dominating the energy market. But beyond that, every time a Democrat gets in and makes some kind of climate deal with foreign states, the Republican comes in a couple of years and reneges on the deal. So we had that with Kyoto, and we had that with Paris. Every time we do this, we lose credibility negotiating. And now when other states make climate deals with us, they anticipate that we're going to renege in a couple of years when the Republican gets in, and they go in expecting to renege on the deal. And most of them don't even make an effort to follow the terms. Most states that have signed on to Paris have not even really made a substantial effort. The European countries aside, they've tried pretty hard. This keeps happening over and over again on issues. We say we're going to hold them to account. We don't hold them to account. If anything, they move to the right, and then their movement to the right gets normalized by the Republicans.
But Ben, surely one of the reasons that happens, I mean, if we're looking at the last, 40 years of data we're trying to establish, and again, I am less confident than you are that from the pattern of the last 40 years of politics, we can develop kind of laws of what happens and what's going to happen. And the uncertainty in it is one reason why I think that the, again, massively increased human suffering, which I'd like to get to, certainly under a Republican administration, cannot possibly be worth it given that we don't exactly know what the possibilities are. If we look back at those 40 years and we say we tried to hold them, I think it has to be remembered, we didn't have a left movement. We didn't have the left, right? We are in the very beginnings, right, of trying to build an organized left. I think the reason that Occupy Wall Street did succeed is not because of this theory that under a Democratic president the movements fail. I think it failed for internal reasons because Occupy Wall Street had a sort of anarchist streak to it that was very against political organizing. And they took a political moment that had this incredible opportunity because everyone was so disgusted with Barack Obama because it was clear that his response was so inadequate. And they started off a protest movement and began to and then they had nowhere to go. Then they had no idea what they were going to turn it into. But it is not obvious to me that the political moment and the nature of Democrats versus Republicans in office is what prevented us from having a successful challenge from the left to Obama, what prevented us from having from Bernie Sanders winning the primary in 2016. In fact, it seems to me as if Bernie Sanders, if Iowa had gone a little differently, if the left had been a little more organized, if Occupy had built into something, I think Bernie Sanders could have won that primary in 2016. And then, in fact, it would have turned out that organizing under a Democrat was actually great grounds for exposing the weaknesses of the Democratic Party and then throwing them out and giving them a left candidate.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think that in the case of Occupy or 1968, we definitely did have a left. There has been a left continuously in American politics. I think that the problem is that under a Democrat, everybody who protests against the Democratic administration from the left, they tend to be anarchists because they're people who don't seek out careers in the administration. And the people who want to be more state-facing end up making nice with the Democratic administration, seek out careers in that Democratic administration, and that means that the opposition is necessarily poorly organized. Whereas when those people don't have jobs in an administration, they then have to build real organization outside of government.
See, I think the thing I dispute is when you say necessarily, right? Because it seems to me like you are describing tendencies that occur that we have to counteract, right? Because it's very obviously true that a Biden presidency is going to be bad for the left in certain ways because you make the point that it's going to breed all these awful Buttigieg's. I think what we don't know is, well, yes, but if we organize ourselves, is it possible to? Young people, right, we know, are inclined towards socialism. I think, and not inclined towards Joe Biden, for example. I actually think, and in fact, I am excited for, to me, when I think about the future and when I think about the next 4 years and what it will be like as a leftist to try and organize in these two climates, I would love Joe Biden to be the president because it's like not having a president at all. I mean, he's so useless. He's not going to be trying to crack down. He's not going to be having protesters thrown into black bags on the streets. When Trump says, like, Democrats are ineffective at controlling protests, kind of right. And but Trump, I really like we're fighting defensive actions. We have I know all these people who are trying desperately to just fend off all of these Trump encroachments onto labor rights, onto the rights of immigrants, and it's just so exhausting. Everything is dominated by Trump. Whereas when I think about under Biden, I will no longer have to focus on this unique horror of Trump and Trump's actions. I can finally, I want to go back to like talking about substance and like critiquing. My favorite thing is to attack liberals. I love attacking liberals. I love attacking Pete Buttigieg's. I want us to be, I don't want to say stabbing. That's going to get me in trouble. I want us to be, rhetorically knifing these people. And I find it very, very difficult to do that when we're all fighting together against this awful Republican administration.
Well, I don't think that Trump is as unique. And I think this is one of our important differences. I think that you find Trump to be a unique threat. And for me, Trump is aesthetically different, but not substantively that different from other Republicans. And I think that in the second term, he's going to look really bad. And it's going to be harder and harder as people get more and more fatigued of it for them to continue to buy into the aesthetic when the results are not coming in. And we saw this in the Bush administration. During the second term of the Bush administration, the approval rating collapsed. It totally collapsed, and it created a big opening. We could do anything at the end of the Bush administration. We could have run anything. The only thing that limited us was our imagination. We could have won with any Democrat, any independent. We could have won with Bernie in 2008 if we had had the imagination to give it a shot. But because we didn't do it then, we missed the window. It's after that second Republican term when people are totally exhausted by it. Everybody's exhausted by it, not just some people, but almost everybody. That's when we can really make a sharp turn. And if we do this, in 4 years, the Democrats aren't going to nominate somebody left-wing. It's either going to be Biden again or some hand-picked Biden successor, Kamala Harris, somebody else. We won't get an opportunity to have someone who's really committed on climate change be president for 8 years if we elect Joe Biden. And we'll have another chance in 4 with everyone so tired of him.
We have another chance at 4 no matter what, though, right? There's always a primary. My theory is, like, either way, no matter what happens, Biden or Trump, the Democrats are going to try to run someone horrendous in 2024. Our job is to stop them. Our job is to put someone forward who can challenge that person, who can overthrow that person. In fact, I think there's a good chance that Biden, of course, won't be able to run for re-election because he's not in fantastic condition at the moment. So it seems to me, I hear you telling kind of a story, but I don't necessarily think that I have the grounds to conclude that it is true. By the way, I don't think Trump is a unique threat. I agree that many of the differences are aesthetic, and that obviously George W. Bush has a far higher body count than Donald Trump, actually, and the Bush nostalgia is so creepy and horrible. But what I do think is that, in fact, even according to your theory, Trump is the worst yet, because your theory is that Republicans get worse and worse over time. So Trump is not just aesthetically worse; he is in fact the next logical stage in the Republicans' move to the right. And I, frankly, am just absolutely terrified of the way that in the second term, Trump may escalate many of the things that he's done that I think have been very, very destructive and have had very serious human consequences. And I am worried about all the millions of lives. And I think when you actually analyze the substance of the difference between what a Biden presidency would look like and a Trump presidency would look like, I mean, we are really talking about whether it's immigration, whether it's climate change, whether it's workplace safety, whether it's the Trump administration rolling back transparency on drone strikes, whether it's, I can go through, whether it's abortion rights, whether it's freeing the police to do whatever they want, whether it's eliminating housing discrimination protections, no matter what it is, there are real people whose lives are going to be fucked up by having this guy another 4 years.
Well, I think that the differences are less pronounced than that, but they look that pronounced. And I think there's value in it looking that pronounced. One of the weaknesses of Republicans is that they do everything in such a blatant and obvious way. It's always so easy to see their excesses. It's so easy to see them because they want to make it visible to their base, which wants to see the cruelty. They want to see the viciousness. And when you have a Democrat, a lot of the same viciousness occurs, but it's not visible. And most of the people who currently criticize that viciousness will defend a Democrat if the Democrat is doing it, and will cover it up and hide it. And we won't get the same level of anti-establishment anger on the left that we need to get someone left-wing in. And we've had such a terrible track record over the years of trying to oust incumbent presidents or incumbent presidents' handpicked successors. When it comes to the middle election, the one after the first term, it's very hard to get a very different Democrat in just 4 years after electing someone like Biden. He's going to dominate the whole narrative in the Democratic Party. He really is. That's what Obama did. It's what Bill Clinton did. It's what they've... Why is this time different? That's my question. Why is this time different?
To me, the response to the fact, I mean, again, we totally agree on the premise, right? You know, when I talk about immigration, you say, well, you know, Obama deported all these people. But there is a massive substantive difference between the Trump administration's immigration policies and the Obama administration's immigration policies. You know, things like sending asylum seekers to Mexico to stay in these dangerous border towns where they get kidnapped and killed. That is a new policy, right? And those are people who would be alive, right? Because it is a new policy that has been introduced. Trump's, you know, increase of the threshold to get asylum in this country has sent actual people back to their deaths who would have, if the status quo had remained, been able to stay in the United States. So I obviously agree that it is more difficult to expose the Democrats because they put on this you know, we love immigrants, you know, we're not the deporters. You know, Joe Biden just lies about this all the time. But I think to my conclusion from that is that our job is to, as the left, right, is not to say, well, more people, we're going to have someone who kills more people so that we can have some actual bodies to hold up. But our job as the left is to say, well, once we get this Democrat into power who's awful, how do we show people the hypocrisy? How do we show people that these people don't mean what they say? Again, this is why my job as current affairs, this is why I am trying to build a left media organization that ceaselessly attacks and exposes people like Pete Buttigieg, because I think it's so important. But I cannot see the value, and I do not want to have to be exposing all of the horrible things Trump is doing, because they really are. We are talking about policies. In fact, we're talking about Trump administration's environmental policies, right? He has rolled back regulations that have resulted in, you know, there's been a massive New York Times investigation into the consequence of the environmental regulation rollback. People are dead. Workers are dead because there are horrible chemicals and pesticides that weren't allowed under the Obama administration that are allowed under the Trump administration. I can't see any justification for allowing more people to die, and he will escalate that regulatory rollback.
But Nathan, it's also the case that the Democrats do new things that cause every bit as much human suffering, if not more, and they do it in less visible ways. Think about welfare reform under Bill Clinton. That's an extremely devastating policy. The bombing of Libya, which caused a civil war in that country, caused its GDP to be cut in half, a civil war that still continues to this day under Obama. There are a lot of people that Democrats killed. The Democrats started the Vietnam War. The Democrats started raising interest rates and driving up unemployment in the 80s. The Democrats started welfare reform. The Republicans under Reagan and Bush never dared to do welfare reform. They would never have thought to do that. They would never have thought they could get away with something so blatant. It's only the Democrats who can get away with these really, really blatant things because people give them a pass and assume that they care and assume that they know what they're doing.
But our job is to not give them a pass, right? This is what we got to do. It's not the alternative is not just run the same script that has been running over and over. I totally agree with you that when Democrats get into office, they try and do things sometimes that are much worse. Although I think, you know, if you go through every federal agency under the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and you say what are the policy changes from the one to the other, I think you will find it's very, very clear that in every, I mean, again, you know, workplace safety, Trump has, you know, slashed it so that more people are dying on the job. They don't send OSHA inspectors, right? These are substantive differences, and I think those differences matter very much. I agree, though, that obviously the Democratic administrations introduced terrible, terrible things, which is why during the Clinton years, I would not have been advocating that people vote Bob Dole in 1996. What I would have been advocating is that we build a powerful left that can expose Bill Clinton and challenge him on these things, and that can actually pose a threat get to, and this is why I like, the Bernie Sanders approach. This is Bernie Sanders supporting Joe Biden in the general election, but challenging Democrats viciously in the primaries. I think that's perfectly sensible to me, because you can work much better with Democrats. You can actually bring them to the table sometimes. Bernie Sanders forced Barack Obama to make certain compromises on things, terrible things that he was going to do, but concessions that you can't even sit down with a Republican president.
Well, I don't think that we should have voted for Bob Dole in 1996, but maybe we should have voted for George H.W. Bush in 1992, because I'm not convinced that George H.W. Bush would have been able to do welfare reform. The Democrats would have had to make a show of opposing it if they were in opposition and trying to criticize a Republican president as being cruel and vicious to the poor. But when a Democrat is in office, the Democrat can make these things seem reasonable when otherwise they would not. And I don't think we can discount that. The most consequential environmental policy of the last 30 years is Barack Obama encouraging so much fracking. And even when he would make a show of acting like he would oppose pipelines, putting it on bomb trains where the oil leaks all over the place and they explode and devastate these towns. That was the most consequential environmental policy. And we can go through all of these regulations, but oftentimes the thing that really shifts the paradigm, welfare reform totally shifted the paradigm on how we look at poor people in this country. Fracking totally shifted the energy paradigm in this country and made oil cheap for decades to come. The big paradigm shifts often occur under Democrats, and they're quiet and they don't look they're not as telegenic.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. But I think our fundamental difference here is that, again, we don't disagree on what Democrats do. As I say, wrote a whole book on Bill Clinton's horrible policies. My response is not, you should have voted for George H.W. Bush, right? My response is, we should have managed to build a left that could come after him, that could come after centrist Democratic candidates in primaries and make it clear, this Ed Markey thing is a really a good example, right? Where Ed Markey was not a progressive Democrat for most of his career. He put on a mask of being a progressive Democrat because it saved his ass in the primary. Because we had built up a left that is capable of shoving them in the right direction, right? Joe Biden had to change his climate policy, right? He had a horrible climate policy. It was dreadful. It got an F from the Sunrise Movement. He had to update it. He had to incorporate elements of the Green New Deal. Now, of course, we say, when he gets into office, he'll be under pressure from all these oil and gas companies to not do any of this. Well, that's absolutely true, which is why we, as an organized left, then take this awful Democratic president we have, who at least is not at least believes climate change exists, right? Which is much better than believing that there should be no emission standards, right? Trump doesn't believe there should be any emission standards. And I think actually the second term is going to be 3 times as bad as the first term if he wins re-election. Because the first term, is a little bit cloud of illegitimacy hanging over him. He didn't win the popular vote. The second term really says, no, keep going, keep doing what you're doing. And I think he is going to massively escalate his attacks on immigrants, massively escalate throwing protesters in vans. He has said he's going to start charging drive-by shooters with domestic terrorism charges. He's going to bring, he's going to massively increase any penalties for harming a police officer. All of this stuff, which I think ends up, if it gets bad enough, seriously demoralizing the left. Because once you start throwing people in Guantanamo for Black Lives Matter leaders into going into indefinite detention. Then it is very difficult to organize. And I don't see it as an argument, we should have a Republican president. I'm like, let's not this time let the Democratic president get away with shit that is going to put another worse Republican in office next time.
Well, if it were the 40s and we had a really well-organized left, then there might be something to say. The left was able to push Franklin Roosevelt on a number of things during his administration, but we don't have the same kind of organization we used to have. We don't have the same kind of unionization rate. I think we have to be realistic when we look at what past generations have tried to do. Everybody has thought as we have. Everybody in the decades past when they were young have thought as we have, and many of them are still thinking this way, that there's going to be some kind of activist breakthrough under a Democrat that's going to enable us to hold them to account or get them to do stuff. But in years past, we say this every time. Every time there's an election, we say we're going to hold them to account. We're going to make them give these policy concessions and stick to it. And it's like peanuts. It's like Charlie Brown and the football. The Democratic Party keeps setting that football up for us and going, you guys are strong and organized and you can move us. And then when we try to move them, they pull the football away and we end up on our butts.
We are objectively in a different position than we have been for a long time, right? You have socialists in Congress, right? AOC wields formidable power considering that she's a first-term 30-year-old socialist, right? Where her endorsement in the Massachusetts Senate primary versus Nancy Pelosi's endorsement of Joe Kennedy, her endorsement was the stronger one, right? Well, it seems to me like we've got the beginning of something here that's very impressive. Bernie Sanders, a socialist, nearly won the presidential primary, twice in a row. I'm not sure that I do see that every time we do the same thing. I think we are building a better and stronger left than we have ever had before. And when I think, unionization rates, they're very low. Well, under another Trump administration, right, I am absolutely certain that they will do whatever they can to prevent people from organizing. They will empower bosses, landlords. They will empower developers. They will do whatever possible to just hand out money and power to the rich and eliminate the entire federal regulatory structure, the limited structure that preserves some right to do some organizing. But, Biden has, again, I'm sure you don't believe that he's going to do any of it, but he has a plan to encourage collective bargaining. He has a pro-union agenda. I don't think it's going to get necessarily better, but he will probably appoint people to, say, the National Labor Relations Board, to the Supreme Court, for example, because obviously we're going to lose a Supreme Court justice if you have your way and Trump gets reelected, that at least aren't trying to wage active war on unions in the same way that Republicans have waged an active, concerted, strategic war on unions for 30 years. And I think not having to fight that war for 4 years, to have it dialed down, I think that really enables us to help build our strength.
Well, the unionization rate in the country has been going down pretty continuously regardless of who's been in office. I don't think there's been a major difference between Democratic and Republican administrations on that front. Unionization rates now are much, much lower than they've ever, and that's a symptom of our weakness. We have no unions. What we have are a few media organizations, and we have social clubs in cities, but we don't have the kind of union organization which we used to have. We have no prospect of building that or replacing it with something else. I don't think that magazines, as much as they're helpful, I don't think that they can replace the organizations that we used to have that really bound people to this stuff. And so we have to be concerned, what if we don't have the ability to move a Democratic president? And what if under that Democratic president, the message that gets sent out to our young, promising people is that if you want to have a successful career in politics, the way forward is to be like Pete Buttigieg. That's the way, because then you'll get a job in the administration, then you'll get the connections and the money that you need to move forward. I don't think that it's been nice to have a few people who support Medicare for all elected to Congress, but we don't have anything like the numbers to get legislation passed, and we've not demonstrated yet any ability to win seats in rural areas, in traditionally red state Republican areas, and we're going to need those seats if we're going to get stuff done. We have no track record of doing it. I'm concerned that many of the people that we're looking to as the leaders of the future, a generation ago, people like Nancy Pelosi looked like that to young people. A generation ago, people like Elizabeth Warren looked like that to young people. And these people, they get us to support them by talking a big game and putting out white papers that seem really cool. And then they get into office, and it is really just a means of getting them reelected over and over and over again. And they're just taking us for a ride, and they're taking ordinary people's money, and they're not doing very much with it.
It almost seems to me, though, that the conclusion that would come out of that, because, as I say, I don't gather from that, well, all I can gather from what you're saying is almost a sense of complete hopelessness, because under a re-elected Donald Trump, my sense is he's going to be massively emboldened, and they are going to escalate their attacks on immigrants. They are going to repeal twice as many environmental regulations in the second term as they did in the first. They are going to, the attack on abortion rights, the attack on unions, and it's just going to be overwhelming. You're never even going to know which way to look because of all the awful shit they are doing day to day, and we're going to be in a real defensive crouch. It seems to me that your perspective does not lead me to say, well, I want that then, because that makes it easier. I don't think there's really any argument that could be easier to organize unions under an NLRB that is actively hostile to them and is overturning every pro-union decision under a Supreme Court that is actively hostile to unions. It almost seems to me that the only conclusion that can come from your perspective is a very bleak kind of nothing is better with either of them. So you might as well have the honest guy who will kill you than the person who will do it with a smile on. And I find that it doesn't seem to me like an argument that Trump is better. It seems to me like an argument that nothing is better than anything else.
Well, I do think that there is some hope. I don't think it's the case that in the second term, Republicans are generally more aggressive than in the first. Quite the opposite. I think the Bush administration, the overwhelming majority of the bad things it did, leaving Kyoto, going into Iraq and Afghanistan, the Patriot Act, and so on, the overwhelming majority came out of the first term. And in the second term, Cheney was sidelined and the administration was much more skittish about taking risks. Similarly with Reagan, most of the Reagan administration's critical decisions were taken in the first term. Usually in a second term, the Republican doesn't make as much progress. And the same goes for Democrats. During Barack Obama's second term, he didn't control both houses of Congress. He got very little passed. I think second terms tend to be full of gridlock and not a whole lot of action. I think probably even less will happen in the second term than in the first. And on many fronts, Trump was defeated. Even in the first term, he couldn't even do repeal and replace without getting voted down by John McCain. I think in the second term, even less is going to happen, especially if we vote for Democrats in the House and the Senate. And I think we absolutely should. We should vote for Democrats in the House and the Senate to ensure the maximum amount of gridlock so that he doesn't get anything accomplished and he has to spend the whole term dealing with the fallout of his mistakes from the previous term. To hold him to account, we need people to see him in charge when it all blows up in his face.
Well, I really, it's such a clearly massive risk to have. So, and if we say, for example, that one of the things that you say in your article is, well, people call Trump an aspiring dictator, but dictators hold sham elections, and Trump hasn't held a sham election. All he has done is say he wants to delay the election, and he has cast doubt on the validity of mail-in ballots, and he has suggested that he might like to have a third term if it was possible, and he's done all these things. He's used the rhetoric of a dictator. It seems to me like on your theory is that, as you say, his bark is not worse than his bite. Trump is, he would love to be a dictator, but he's too lazy.
I wouldn't say that.
Well,
he is operating in a different kind of country from the kind of country where dictatorships happen, a country that has been democratic for a long time, where the conception of legitimacy in the country is very much influenced by commitment to the Constitution, which is treated like a Bible, by our Republican friends. They treat this stuff like a religion. It's the ideology that's taught to us in school. And I think in these embedded democracies that have been around a long time, a lot of people are dissatisfied with institutions and they want change. But their understanding of the institutional reforms they prefer is thoroughgoingly democratic. I think even our Trump-supporting friends are supporters of democracy. I do. And I think that
I don't agree with that.
The Democrats want us to think about it like this, because if we're thinking about it like this, then we have no choice but to support them. They did this with Bush when they said he wanted to be King George the Fourth. And this goes all the way back in our politics to Andrew Jackson, people calling Andrew Jackson a wannabe king, a wannabe tyrant. And this rhetoric can be helpful in restraining the behavior of a president that we don't like. But in our country, our president has pretty delimited power compared with a lot of other democracies. If you look at the president of France or the prime minister of the United Kingdom, our president is very much hemmed in. And to succeed in breaking out of those constitutional hems, Donald Trump would need to be backed by some force in the state willing to overturn the Constitution.
Well, or just get another couple of Supreme Court justices.
Well, as you pointed out just recently, he doesn't have support in the military. And in states where you don't have military support, if you try to ignore elections or you try to hold sham elections, what happens is that the military arrests you and throws you out.
It seems to me like you have an awful lot of confidence that I don't find warranted. That first off, the Republicans don't give a shit about the Constitution. They speak of the Constitution, and they, as you say, they do in fact hold it up as their Bible, but they also hold the Bible up as their Bible. And the Republicans seem to be, especially now that the Republican Party, right, has been almost totally, like, the never-Trump Republicans are a minority of the party. Most Republicans have just signed on to full-on Trumpism. And it seems to me that actually it turns out that what Republicans, mostly a class analysis is true. It's not, in fact, about the great principles of U.S. democracy. In fact, when you read conservative philosophy, books like Against Democracy, we don't want democracy because, people, if you have democracy, people don't like the market. So you got to get rid of democracy in order to make sure that capitalism is free to flourish. I don't at all have any confidence whatsoever that Trump or any of the Republican Party have a serious commitment to ensuring that everyone is enfranchised. In fact, it seems to me like we're constantly fighting a war with them over making sure that people can vote, because they'd rather nobody. If nobody voted, they'd be perfectly fine with that. If nobody voted, that would please Trump plenty, which is, so he's going to cast doubt on the legitimacy of this outcome no matter what. In fact, Bernie Sanders, in fact, has just said he's extremely worried, and he's actually going to start giving speeches on the fact that he's worried that Trump will refuse to leave office if he's not reelected, and that he will cast doubt upon, if the result is close, he will cast doubt upon the outcome. And then, of course, you are relying on your faith in the democratic principles of the United States military, which you and I just have totally different assessments of how much we want to stake on the Republican Party and the United States military preventing a lapse into authoritarianism in this country.
Well, you don't have to just rely on their democratic principles. You can poll them and ask them if they support the president and if they would support the president if the president did these things. And they say no. The generals, the intelligence community, nobody in our elite likes the president. The ordinary troops don't like the president. This is why the president was asking to delay the election, because if the president loses the election, he knows he will have to go. He knows that if he tries to avoid going, that he will be hauled off. He knows that. That's why he would try to delay it. If he knew that he could ignore the result no matter what it is, he would make no effort to delay it. He would make no effort to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the outcome. He knows that if he loses, he will have to stand down, and if he doesn't stand down, he will be arrested. That's how democracies that have a little bit of history and have ordinary people committed. I'm not saying that Jason Brennan, the people like Jason Brennan are committed Democrats, or that the people in the Republican elite are committed Democrats. But the ordinary Republican voter, I come from Indiana, which is full of ordinary Republican voters. The ordinary Republican voter is perfectly committed to democracy and not at all an authoritarian. The ordinary Republican voter is worried about deep state conspiracies in which the elite mess with democracy, mess with the popular will, which has elected Donald Trump. That's the narrative in the ordinary Republican's mind. It's not this libertarian stuff that comes out of their academy or National Review. The ordinary Republican is a perfectly normal American in most respects.
The ordinary Republican is not the elected Republican, right? I mean,
but the
I agree.
elected Republican can't hold dictatorial power without a support base. And Donald Trump does not have a support base for seizing authoritarian power. He doesn't have it in the military. He doesn't have it in ordinary voters. He doesn't have it in the court system. There is no other part of the state which would support an authoritarian takeover by Donald Trump. And he needs a coalition to accomplish that within the institutions.
I agree with that at the moment, right? My fear, my big fear, and again, I don't think we're going to resolve this because I think this comes down to a difference in our assessment of the risk of various things. My fear is that even if the outcome that you talk about is more probable, I do not want to risk the situation in which over the next 4 years, many people are disenfranchised at the state level. Trump gets another couple of Supreme Court justices, and this time he picks them far more carefully. He gets judges at every level. Every federal agency, it just... And you say, well, you could look at, Bush didn't do much in the second term when he was straining under the scandals of the Iraq War and Katrina. Well, that's true, but the fact that Bush didn't does not, I don't want to use that to give me the confidence that having this man again is not going to result in many of the things that he is talking about, which is, I've looked at his agenda, right? And one of the things he talks about is bringing violent extremists like Antifa to justice. That's one of his big second-term agenda items. Well, that means prosecuting activists, throwing them in federal prison for years. He's directed prosecutors to always seek the maximum penalty. And in fact, we just had this incident where there was the shooting in Portland, and Trump's federal agents just went and shot the guy, the suspect. Right? He's dead. They just went around 4 of them and they put bullets in him. And to me, I look at that and I think, my God, if he gets reelected, there's not really going to be much stopping him from escalating that. If he has a compliant court system, I don't think that the military is going to stop him from arresting and prosecuting left-wing activists. And to me, it might not happen. It's possible. The risk that it could happen.
The shootings and persecutions of left-wing activists did not begin under Donald Trump. And the thing is, he talks about they do this all the time. They tell us all these policies they're going to do. They tell us all these things they're going to do. But where's the institutional support for doing this stuff? There's still, if we vote for a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, we will have strong checks as the Republicans had during Barack Obama's second term.
And if we don't,
when's the last time we had any president from either party who had a very active second term, who got very much it all done in their second term? Either party.
I am a person who does not think that past I think you have a very limited pool of data to draw from. I'm actually very skeptical of political science, as generally, because I think that what it tends to operate on a base level assumption that things that have happened previously will continue to happen because there are sort of rules or laws.
I agree with that. And I think that we should absolutely think about how now is different. But what I'm looking for is some kind of explanation for how it's different, because unless I have a reason to think it's different, then I default to thinking it might be the same again. And one of the things I've noticed in the way that the left tends to handle these elections is that every time historically we assume it's different and then it's not. So I want an argument for how it's different.
Here's an argument. George W. Bush didn't say he was going to start prosecuting Antifa. He didn't say he was going to start prosecuting left-wing dissidents. That wasn't a signature agenda item. He said he was going to
privatize Social Security, and then he didn't do that. He tried to privatize Social Security, and he didn't come particularly
but he didn't have
close.
The power to privatize security. I tell you for damn sure that Trump has the power to start throwing activists in prison. And I don't know what we'd even do about it if he started to do it. Because I don't count on the Democrats to hold him accountable very well. I think you and I share the belief that they are largely useless, and that is even on the assumption that we managed to get a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. If God forbid we didn't, or we lost that after 2 years, then you would have really eliminated any means of holding Donald Trump accountable, which to me is so scary that I am not willing to gamble on it, because I do think I truly hope that if he wins, because I think there's a good chance that he wins, I truly hope it goes the way that you say it will, and that actually it turns out he's just pretty useless. He doesn't manage to get much of anything done. He's all talk. And we are able to, in 2024, push through our great left candidate who will defeat, Pete Buttigieg on his second run or whatever, and we will redeem the country because it will be in tatters because of Trump. I hope that's how it goes. But I see in my mind a very different possible way it could go, and it keeps me up at night, and it gives me nightmares. And I want to believe you, because the thing you say to me is very reassuring. It's very comforting, right? To someone who worries about these things. But I don't believe that the evidence is there to make me convinced enough to think that it is wise to prefer a president whose agenda I look at and it is everything I despise, versus Joe Biden, whose at least public agenda I look at and it's like restoring the rights of unions and seriously addressing climate change, all of those things. I'm like, for God's sakes, give me like a pathetic version of that versus a pathetic version of this nightmare of like, we're going to start deporting anyone we deem to be an MS-13, and we're also going to eliminate all of the due process that decides whether you're an MS-13. Therefore, we're just going to say we can deport anyone we like.
Well, it's not that we don't get a pathetic version of it. What we get is something else altogether that they never told us about. We get something like fracking, which was never something that Barack Obama ran on. Barack Obama ran on helping unions and ran on doing stuff about clean energy and not going to Alaska and drilling oil out of the ground. And then he did nothing about unions and oversaw the greatest expansion of the oil industry in the last half a century. It's the things they don't tell you about and the things that they don't like to talk about that are their most consequential decisions. Barack Obama didn't run on destroying Libya, and Biden is going to do things that he's not telling us about, that we're going to find out about. And they're going to be every bit as bad as everything that you've described that Trump would do. I think that going and blowing up Libya and tearing it to shreds is a lot worse than sending a few American activists to prison. Yeah. I think that going and doing fracking and changing the oil price all over the world and incentivizing everyone in the world to burn as much oil and gas as they want, I think that has extremely devastating long-term consequences for people in countries in the developing world, in the tropics, that are going to get hit by floodwaters. And that decision that Barack Obama made is going to kill a lot more people than anything Donald Trump has done. And those decisions are not the ones they run on. They're not the ones they tell us about. And at this point, we have to start noticing that they keep doing this. They keep doing it every time.
Well, I certainly agree that they keep doing it, because I spend my life writing about all the shit these people do. I do think there is. Look, I mean, there are differences amongst. I caution people against becoming too cynical to where they can't notice important differences. I mean, for example, there was a very strong difference of opinion between Hillary Clinton, who was a serious hawk, and Joe Biden, even over the Libya thing. Joe Biden has.
Well, Joe Biden wanted to petition. He wanted to partition Iraq into separate enclaves and forcibly relocate people.
Yeah, that was extremely stupid and indefensible. But
that would have killed a huge number of people and ruined a huge number of people's lives. And they don't run on this stuff, but that's what they do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I certainly agree with that. I mean, I'm very cynical about the Democratic Party. But, when I look at some of the most important issues to me, when I look at climate change, when I look at immigration, when I look at all the environmental rollbacks, when I look at what the situation that is going to face workers in an environment where there are simply no enforcements of workplace safety or wage theft regulations, where consumer protection is just sort of not enforced. To me, I don't want to have to be dealing with all of that. And I think, we have different assessments as to how much human harm is going to be caused under each of these men. I think where we can agree, perhaps we can come to some serious agreement, is to end this, is that no matter who wins, they are going to be bad. They're going to be. We're not going to get a good president in this election. And the job of us as leftists is, in either situation, to make sure that in 2024 we are ready. Because if we are not ready in 2024, no matter who is president, they are going to do the same thing all over again. If Joe Biden, I think actually the Republicans might be worse no matter who's in power. But however this unravels, however this unfurls and goes, nothing is going to get better until we organize ourselves successfully to challenge the party establishments.
Yeah, we're in a negative, self-reinforcing downward spiral in which each party encourages the other to become worse. And until we find a way to break free of that, every time we change parties, we are accelerating it.
Yeah, I think I think that should scare us all, and that's the. I am a very strong proponent of voting for Biden and getting him into office because I just despise Trump so much, and I don't want to ever think about him again. And I would relish the opportunity to go after the nasty Buttigiegian liberals in a Biden administration. But I do believe that. No matter what, this is we're caught in something that is deeply harmful and troubling, and that it is not going to resolve itself internally. It is only going to be acted upon by the external pressure of powerful activist movements and labor. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a mutually amicable conclusion. Thank you so much, Benjamin Studebaker.
Thanks so much for having me, Nathan.